Hey everyone, Happy New Year. I'm coming to you from a different conference room. I'm usually in cheeses, but today I'm in beets. You can see these beets behind me. So I hope everyone had an awesome New Year's and you drank lots of bubbly wine or bubbly beer or soda, whatever. As long as you had carbonation, I'm happy. Thanks for all your awesome comments on that video. That was a fun one to make. And I think I'm going to dive probably a little bit more into beverages this year because they're just really fascinating and there's lots to cover. But there were three really good questions that I wanted to address in the comments and just go a little bit deeper on those today. So the first one was from Brenda Strand, who's asking, she said, I can't do sweet wines at all. They make me feel ill. She said Moscato, definitely not. So which of the driest of the bubblies? Which one is the driest of the bubblies? So champagne, there's designations on all of the bottles to tell you basically how much residual sugar is left in there. And so if you know the terms, you can kind of hunt out and find what you want. So I'll go over three that are in the category, in the realm that you'd be interested in. And so starting at the very driest is extra brut. And so this has a designation of having 0.6% or less sugar in it. That's how much residual sugar is left in there. And most people find it completely dry. They don't associate it with any sweetness at that level of sugar. So next down the list, a little bit sweeter is brut. And this is where most champagnes live. And this category is 1.5% sugar or less sugar. So 1.5 is the max that it can have. And again, most people on the lower end of the spectrum will find them really dry. But on at 1.5%, if it has that much in it, it could come off as kind of semi-dry or a little bit sweeter. But that's the biggest classification. But there's a fair amount of range within that. And then the next step down, which is I think as far as you probably want to go, considering your aversion to sweetness, is a little bit of a confusing category, and that's extra dry. So you see the name dry in there, and it sounds like it would be really dry, especially since it's extra dry. But the fact is they can be kind of semi-dry to even semi-sweet, up to about 2% residual sugar in there. So I would probably tend to stay away from those, and I would stick with brut or extra brut to get a really dry champagne. So I hope that helps. So the next question comes from Oscar, and he wanted to know about the nitrogenated beverages, like his favorite stouts that he sees at the bar. And so that's when nitrogen is also added to the mix. And so what's really interesting is those are not made with just pure nitrogen. You're not just subbing in nitrogen for carbon dioxide. They're usually made with something called beer gas, which on average has 75% nitrogen and 25% CO2. And so it's still got a little bit of that prickly pain that we talked about in that video from the CO2 and some of that acidity. So you still get a little of that presence. But then it also has nitrogen in there. And when nitrogen is dissolved, it's really interesting. It actually makes the beer or whatever beverage it is sweeter. So if you've ever had a nitro coffee where they just they add nitrogen and pressurize it in coffee, it has a natural sweetness to it, and that nitrogen in solution just tastes a little bit sweet. It also has a really creamy mouthfeel, so that's what you notice a lot with those stouts. So it's usually beer gas, and you actually see a lot of folks adding, putting a lot of different types of beer on beer gas now, and getting some pretty cool effects. So that's the story behind nitrogen in your beer. And so the last question I wanted to get into, which I thought was a really good one, was from Jim Cletus, and he was saying, so does the cost of champagne make a difference in the bubbles? And so there's kind of a theory or a misconception out there that more expensive champagne has finer bubbles, so smaller bubbles, and it's really not true, but I think I can explain a little bit of the theory of why we think that. But so basically, if you want finer bubbles in any bubbly beverages, you basically just want less CO2 in there. Because what happens is as you form one of those CO2 bubbles on a speck of dust, whatever, it grows and grows because it's absorbing more dissolved carbon dioxide. So it gets bigger and bigger. And so if you have more CO2 in the mix, then those bubbles get bigger and they feel a lot bigger on your tongue. So really highly carbonated things, the bubbles will feel big. So what happens with those older bottles of champagne is if you let them age, and it's usually the expensive ones that people age, a little bit of CO2 is always escaping that bottle, like a tiny, tiny bit, even in a sealed bottle. And so if you age it for years and years, you actually have less CO2 in that bottle. So the bubbles can end up tasting finer to you, finer and smaller. But it's really just an issue of something being undercarbonated that the bubbles feel finer. So no, it is not true. You cannot make a direct correlation between expense or quality and the size of the bubbles in the mix. Okay, so I hope that was really helpful. Thanks again for all of your awesome comments, and I'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks, guys.